So today I'm going to be presenting this nicely titled presentation, Working with the Community for Equity-Based Research in the Sociology of Agriculture. This is a research project that Dr. Schulman and I have been working on for almost 2 years now. And I'm going to elaborate further on that specific project in about 2 slides from now. But what I want to note from the jump is that this presentation itself, similar in a sense to what Dr. Schulman was doing, is based upon personal reflections as well as data from the research project, data we've collected over time. So to begin, when thinking about equity and research design, right, we have to start with what I think of as this distinction between research as traditionally practiced, right, which is research for people, which I think can often sound really nice, but in a sense is about a lack of oversight from communities affected by that research, right? That the researcher has the capacity to decide on research design, data collection methods, interpretation of the data, analysis results, the programming ideas that would come out of it, right? And I'm not automatically stating that that's somehow a priori negative, right? It doesn't have to be, but that there is a distinction with that traditional model of doing research, where the researcher has a lot of power and control over the project, and a research project that's based within this idea of research with people. That is a research project that we've seen in the past. Like, this isn't some like novel idea, right? There's participatory action research. There's the team building that Dr. Schulman was talking about. There's citizen science, right? That there are lots of models of community engagement. And what community engagement is doing is it's developing a space for dialogue, right? Open communication between researchers and the multitude of stakeholders that are out there, and producing a horizontal relationship in order to decide on what questions are being asked, what instruments would be utilized, etc. Right? And that's based also upon listening, that the researcher, while having expert knowledge and a certain set of specialized skills, should continue to listen to the community, to take in what the community is saying, even if that's criticism, and adapting to those situations. Because equity in this sense is a starting point, right? A premise for doing research, whereby we act in a way so that we are equal partners developing knowledge. And it's also a process, because we have to understand that while yes, we can begin from a point of equality, that does not mean in an unequal world that there is actual equality between all the members. There's differences of class, differences of race, differences of status that all can impact, so that there also needs to be processes put in place with the research team and the community members and the researchers that seek to reinforce equity, right, as premise and process, and then therefore the outcome of the research. And in a major way, I've been thinking a lot lately about how Paulo Freire, and I have his nice book right here, kind of informs my thinking on this. And he has this great part in education, and my Portuguese is not always the greatest, so I'm going to butcher this, conscientização, where he says, right, that when the two poles of the dialogue, thinking about this horizontal relationship, are thus linked by love, hope, and mutual trust, they can join in a critical search for something. And I want to return to that idea of mutual trust a couple times in this presentation, because one of the things that this equity in research design is also attempting to address is distrust. In part, distrust of researchers for histories of extractive research, etc. Right? So in a good sense, we've been able to employ this idea of equity in research design in our current project, where we've been working with the Rural Advancement Fund International. The Rural Advancement Fund International, or RAFI henceforth, received a SARE grant to focus on financial and emotional distress that farmers are confronting, right? That they are seeing these crises as intertwined crises, that there's a structural determinant there of stress. And we received a subcontract from Rafi to be able to design the research, to aid in data analysis, et cetera. And from the beginning of that research project, we have been part of a collaborative research team that's made up of, universities, right? So not only Dr. Schulman and I, but also other university representatives at different universities in the state, nonprofit representatives, specifically Rafi, but also other nonprofit members of the team representing different professions, right? So also different skill sets vis-a-vis the world that we live in, and then also community partners, that is farmer collaborators themselves. And those farmer collaborators are in each of the research team meetings, right? We meet weekly, bi-weekly, a lot of the time weekly, and they're at every single research meeting as this other voice, right? To bring up their concerns, their suggestions, their ideas, and to be full team members, so that even the presentations that we develop out of this project are built on that collaborative mode. And that has been incredibly important even to our data collection strategy. One, because of the necessity for trust building with these networks to access research participants on a topic that is traumatizing, right? So it's not like it's a topic that someone automatically wants to share this narrative with someone about. And if you don't have those trust relationships, if you don't have that social capital really to expend with those communities, there is a decrease in capacity to even conduct the research project. And even more with the institutional review board, there's a lot of questions, right? You're asking to access these stories. Well, what is being put in place in order to minimize that risk? And collaboration across communities in an equitable way is one way to minimize those risks, right? And increase data sovereignty, which I think is another key component of doing these kinds of community engaged projects, that is assuring those individuals that share their stories that they have control over their data or some level of oversight over that data. And it's not just the researcher extracting said data, maintaining control, and then being able to leverage that for their own careers and benefits, right? So what I want to do is I want to highlight some of the evidence and then personal reflections from a subset of the overall interviews, because this project encompasses interviews with white, Black, and Indigenous farmers. I want to just highlight those responses from the Black farmers and our experiences working in that space, right? First and foremost is understanding where distress comes from, and that distress comes from processes of inequity, right? Of inequality that lead to distress, because certain institutions over the history and at times even contemporarily commit practices that can be described as institutionally racist and discriminatory. And by dint of acting in that way, even if farmers within a community have not had direct experience of those actions, they can have indirect shared collective experiences and collective ideas around that create distrust. And that distrust not only has negatively impacted the farmers, right, but it can also impact the polity overall, right? Increasing levels of distrust means that certain things that are going to require social solidarity become much harder to do. So one example that we have, right, is of the USDA from the interviews, and one of the farmers said, yeah, I try to go to some friends or fellow farmers first based off what I've read and what I've heard. The USDA was, if you applied for a loan as a Black farmer, 360 days, and as a white farmer, 30 days. Banks are as bad for Black folks. You could be twice as good and you still won't get stretched way out. And people pretend like that doesn't exist anymore, like that's not real. That is still real every day, right? So that there's a navigating through a social network outside of these institutions because of the distrust, right? Like, and notice that this farmer is not stating that it was their personal experience, that they're stating that it's the personal experience of people in their network and that by dint of that, they have an increasing distrust of those institutions, right? So equity is important because if we start to build community engaged projects, we can work to rebuild that trust relationship, right? And as I said, part of that distrust is distrust that extends to researchers themselves, because researchers themselves represent institutions that also have their own histories of discriminatory or inequitable actions. And one of the major components we found as aiding and establishing that trust again is working towards shared goals, right? That what research can accomplish, what research should accomplish, has to be something that's mediated by the team itself and all team partners. And researchers play an important role here of also setting expectations. Like, researchers might have increased status on one end, but that does not mean that researchers or their project can shift the overall structure of society. In a certain sense, it's being able to state, that research often provides evidence that can support policy programming and organizing that can be beneficial. So that research in and of itself may not shift the actual relations that are the inequitable relations within a society, but it can support the maneuvers that could bring about that change, right? But at times, because there are discordant objectives and a sense of mistrust or distrust on the part of community members, based within what we could call righteous anger, right? Like if you're a community that has historically and contemporarily experienced oppression, you can rightfully be angry, frustrated with the pace of change. And that, research in and of itself doesn't reshape that structural inequality. And so dialoguing around what research can do, and also assuring that research has tangible outcomes, right? This quote comes actually from a different project, but it's always stuck with me. Is, not another report that sits on a shelf, or not another academic publication that sits behind a paywall. The academic publications are incredibly important. I don't want to, deprecate them, but that when doing community work, there has to be something more than an outcome that's beneficial to the researchers, right? And so dialoguing around what those possible outcomes could be, what kind of programming support research could provide, right? That is a way to establish that mutual trust. And it develops a shared understanding, one that researchers themselves need to be more cognizant of, because researchers might not be aware of these other outcomes that are needed from the research that they're doing, right? That our own blind spots due to our own specializations and skill sets. So shared goals is another important thing. And this, you see how there's these interconnections between Dr. Schulman's presentation and this presentation. One, because Dr. Schulman's on both of them, but also this idea of bridging capital or social capital, bonding capital, another one of these things, right? And based within that shared goals and what research can accomplish is a capacity also to listen to one's clients, right? That better programming comes from being able to establish a systematic trend within the data set that shows where there might be gaps or where there's already assets and what could be strengthened. So bridging capital can also support that strengthening, because it links those on the ground to formal organizations that have access to resources and information that can be leveraged to, say, decrease the likelihood of financial risk that can lead to asset loss. That is, farmers losing their land, or decrease the likelihood of isolation that increases acute crises, right? That there are ways, and these are just possible trends. I'm not arguing at this moment in time that there's a certainty about the capacity of X to lead to Y, but that these are possibilities that have been apparent in the data that arise from this equitable relationship that's occurring between the community partners, the NGOs, and the universities. And so one of these major resource sharing things that has been coming up quite often is, say, Rafi, who is on the project team. Rafi sometimes has information about, non-traditional lenders or grants or something like that. So you can go to Rafi, for those kinds of things. And that information is crucial because, it's not always readily accessible where you could get alternative forms of funding. And being cut off from those alternative forms of funding, especially during periods of financial risk, can increase the likelihood of asset loss. So bridging capital, producing solidarity can increase resource sharing as one outcome of these more equitable relationships. And that also increases, an idea of what research might be able to accomplish through these types of relationships. And then one of the things as a researcher, I think the most pivotal is this oversight, right? That equity, because representation matters, especially when designing research and interpreting data, equity means that there is a way to challenge results from the communities involved in the project. That there may be differing perspectives, and that can lead to that dialogue once again, and that dialogue leading to a consensus. That in and of itself can increase the quality of the results. So it's not just that equity is like a normative position or a normative ethical position vis-a-vis doing research, but also that it is maybe a something that we should presuppose as a necessity for better quality research, right? So not only is it an ethical, but also it's a matter of the quality of the research itself, because the competing perspectives, the competing interpretations can push people to have to strengthen their arguments and justify themselves even that much more, right? So that there's a constant oversight over the research project from these community partners. So we could say, right, that coming out of this project, that we should begin with community participation, as we should begin with equity and build that into the research process, following models, like I said, of citizen science, of participatory action research, so on and so forth, right? There are a lot of good models out there for how to do this. Slow down for equity. Recognize that debating and consensus making around, say, research results will elongate the process of doing research. That even something as simple as developing an interview protocol, or maybe it's not that simple, it's kind of complex, but it grows in time because of the fact that questions can be challenged by a multitude of groups. And that can even be things, not just like the nature of the question, its operationalization of some kind of concept, but just around language, right? And so we have to have an expectation of being to slow down for equity. Another is compensation and time. If community partners are participating in the research project and they're there, the research team, there should be funding made available to them, right? That time is also valued. We exist in a society where our lives are commodified, and so you should make sure that grants are written, or budgets for grants are written in such a way to be able to compensate that time. Another is data sovereignty and community control, right? A lot of this is about oversight. It's about assuring that the stories aren't just extracted and walked away with. And then that mutual trust comes from these clarity of goals and deliverables, that we develop a shared understanding of what research can do and the outcomes that that research will provide. One other thing is that it's not always perfect, right? That we should understand it is not a panacea. One, there are structural and institutional constraints on conducting this type of research, right? For instance, grant timelines might not allow for that slowing down for equity. Or there can be tenure clocks that can impact how quickly junior scholars need to be able to put out research. These are kinds of institutional constraints that aren't necessarily about community engagement itself in research, but about the institutions in which research occurs. But there are other things. It wasn't every time that we were having a debate that debate was actually strengthening the project results or something. There can be derailing conversations. There can be moments where your qualitative codebook is an ever-expanding codebook because there is a differential level of skill vis-a-vis coding data. And that's when the researcher can and should do better at explaining, how research can occur and try and bring pragmatism into those conversations. There's also risks, right? Just because community partners are involved does not mean that they're going to always be willing to expend political capital. That doesn't mean that the people that they know in your ever expanding network will expend their political capital. And by dint of that, that can also lead to its own obstacles. Also, those competing expectations can lead to raucous moments, we can call it, right? That is, there are points in time where, competing ideas of what research should do or what needs to occur can produce major tensions, and that can also slow down certain aspects of the research or lead to really serious conflicts. And that gets back to needing to establish mutual trust. And also, there's also divides in people's access to resources to be able to participate. And that also gets back to that compensation that we need to be cognizant of, say, something like the digital divide. Not everybody has access to a solid internet connection to be able to participate, right? And then as a researcher, I also want to note that there can be a loss of researcher autonomy. Some of that can be a loss of objectivity, right? Being involved subjectively in the process, and we're always all subjectively in a research process. I mean, even the most natural of sciences has ideological constraints in the framing of questions and answers. And as a sociologist, I don't want to bring us down a rabbit hole, but we should be cognizant of how participation in community engagement can shape the way that research results become interpreted, right? And that's also another reason why we have to include in our research methodology further checks and balances to be able to compensate for that. Further, there's also loss of researcher autonomy vis-a-vis a budget. And then lastly, also in terms of theory, possibly. And so there might be times when there needs to be increased levels of researcher autonomy or more community engagement, that maybe it's not always an absolute, but that's something that occurs through that dialogue, right? So there can be these drawbacks, but I would argue that the benefits of community engagement and increased equity between researchers and the communities they're meant to serve outweigh these drawbacks, right? So to conclude, research with people is distinct from research for people, right? Because of our status in society, researchers have power to impose questions and answers upon the population that can be counterproductive. That is, a researcher has the capacity to shape knowledge and shape how we perceive ourselves as scientific subjects. And because of that, there's an added ethical obligation to be aware of that power and that role, and to attempt to reduce that amount of power through these forms of more equitable research. And that researching with people changes that dynamic, right? By becoming co-equal partners in the construction of that knowledge, that it is not only beneficial, right, for scientific progress, right? As I said, that it's scientific, the quality of the results can become better, but also the public good, right? And in terms of the public good, just thinking about trust, kind of anecdotally, we can see in our own society how distrust of science can have very real ramifications for myriad of policies and programming, and in ways that can be ultimately very detrimental to people's well-being. So there's added reasons to start thinking about ways of strengthening this community engagement, which I know a lot of researchers are doing. Researchers, I saw a few of them that are attendees in this very room right now. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions, or questions also for Dr. Schulman from his prior presentation. And I will stop this screen share. Are there any questions? There's nothing in the chat. No. I can start us off with a question because I did have a question for you, Dr. Schulman. When navigating like the different disciplines, how do you resolve like different ways of, say, collecting data, measuring and analyzing data across different kind of disciplinary backgrounds? Or how did it get navigated?
It's a good question, and I'm pausing. And again, my memory is undoubtedly has massive holes in it. You know, I honestly don't remember there being elaborate discussions of the pros and cons of quantitative versus qualitative. I think, as I looked at my colleagues, definitely people had different strengths and different preferences in terms of how they went about collecting data. But it was more a sense of people brought different skills to the table along with their experiences. So I do think perhaps this is where, another issue involving having a focus on equity and equity outcomes and community engagement is important, is that the issues that occupy us in the professional journals about, the strengths and weaknesses of, one approach versus the other become very secondary to the need to be able to accomplish a set of objectives in terms of the specific project or proposal, and again, work with the community and the existing resources.
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, it's not to argue that, the academic professional discussions are unimportant, but they need to become grounded. So yes, indeed, this is something I might say, yes, indeed, in an ideal world, if we had unlimited money, we would do an absolute random sample and try to get, at least this percentage of this population and, get them, to respond to this questionnaire and all these sorts of questions, but we're not going to be given an unlimited budget or unlimited time. This is what, the particular proposal has in terms of its limits. This is what we can do in the time. How can we best, in a sense, come up with a research protocol that meets both the professional academic standards, but also is realistic in terms of what we can do given the time and money, and again, what's appropriate for work within this community. Okay, well, I'll give a first answer. Well, one of the things that the pandemic did is require our interviews to be done via distance, either telephone or Zoom. In the initial when the initial proposal was written, it was assumed that we would be able to do in-person interviews with farmers. That got completely thrown out, which meant that we had to redo both our research protocols and our methods. But this is, again, where the digital divide kind of comes in. I'll give you an example. One of our farmer collaborators, Mr. L, to join a meeting, has to literally get in his car, drive, park outside a library, and then get into the library's net on his cell phone.
Mm-hmm.
So it delayed research. It also caused us to, in a sense, reconceptualize everything that we're doing. And I think, it made the effort to participate, even though the people were being financially compensated, much more of a concerted decision. It wasn't just, oh yeah, all right, I'll get on this Zoom call. Yeah, for those of us connected to the university networks, that's, all right, no big deal. Gee, I don't even have to, change into decent clothes. I'll just wear my pajama bottoms to do my Zoom call. It's very different for somebody who has to literally get in his car, drive X numbers of miles, park outside a library. And in actually one of the cases, actually got harassed about what he was doing there. All right, Andy, I've talked. I'll pass the baton to you.
With that last point you made is, I think, crucial to it, right? That it does require concerted effort, and things that researchers might not consider as onerous really can be. And I think another part of that has been our being cut off from communities in a larger sense, right? Our research team is very collaborative, but we haven't been able to do the things that the project had wanted to do pre-pandemic when the grant was originally made, such as community-based presentations, and more of them. And I think now we'll get more of that chance, but that would have been an even stronger way to network. Because while I love all the floating heads on Zoom, you can't always beat being face to face with somebody and being able to talk about these issues. So that's what I would say, is that we haven't been able to do as much of the community outreach that the project calls for as we would have liked. Yeah. And then we have one other question here, potentially tricky, but could you address the conflict between typical faculty incentives or expectations, the need to publish X amount per year, and the requirements of working more deliberately and slowly when engaging the community? Are there specific policies that need to be adjusted or to accommodate this kind of work? And just, I'll take a quick swing at it. I think from this project and a prior project, it has been definitely clear that a part of what a research grant is also funding for these applied research projects or community engaged research projects is networking, right? Is bringing people together and dialoguing, and the dialogue is slow. One of the things that I talked with Michael about one day when we were discussing preparing for this presentation was, in Zapatista territory, they're called caracoles, which is snails, and because thinking about democracy is this very slow process of building horizontal relationships that all requires people sharing similar ideas about what even like base level words mean. And so that's very hard though to navigate the policy changes that would need to occur to allow that model of research to proliferate more. And I would, as a pessimist, say that that's probably not totally in the cards. So maybe what needs to happen is kind of like, and this I want to pass it back to Michael, Dr. Schulman, is these kinds of teams that can pull off different fragments at different moments in time. That maybe what we're having to do is adapt to a situation, to conditions outside of our control in the best way that we can, in order to address a necessity of slower, more equity-based research. Michael?
All right, well, that's an important question that's raised. Again, from recollection, from my experiences, one of the things, just in terms of thinking about the team as a whole, it's important to have people who are at different stages of their career. As I mentioned, it's important to have senior faculty who can afford to take risks, who can, afford the extra time and involved and provide leadership in that direction. And if that involves, cutting down one's productivity, that might be a risk one needs to take, particularly if you're at a senior level in one's career. And the other thing is this issue of having, again, the phrase is having projects. If I was a junior faculty person, I would, reflecting upon my colleagues, I think what I would say about them is that they had projects that were producing the more traditional deliverables while they were engaged in these projects, which had more of a long-term or iffy prospect. So this is the issue. And again, it's easier to say than do because no one's time is infinite. It's, would be important, to have projects that produce some immediate payoffs for people's tenure clock, to be quite specific, while at the same time allowing them to engage in more long-term kind of issues. So in terms of university policies and reviews, it really is a question of trying to look, not just count things, but also look at the prospects for a variety of future outcomes.
Mhm.
And that's easier to say than do. I mean, I really am immensely impressed by, both the hard work and the ability of the junior colleagues that I've interacted with to mediate this incredibly important and complex question.
Any other questions?
All right, well, I think it's almost 12 o'clock. So please, thank you very much for listening and thank you for your questions and interest in this topic. And I guess with that, we'll press the magic button. And everyone stay safe and good luck with all your efforts and your work in this incredibly important and issue for all of us in the academy.
I'm gonna second what Michael said so eloquently. Y'all have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you.